Okay. So we talked about the necessity to write the place, and they have to. It's preferable to write both the place where the transaction took place and the place where the shtar was written up, if it was written up in a different place. And it's really more important to designate the place where the kinyan took place, because that's what determines, let's say, local custom as far as how the law is treats us this kind of transaction. Okay. Okay. We'll finish. We'll continue now with. I think we did all of the. Okay. I think we're still in the Imrei Yaakov in Halacha Tes Zayin. So let me just make sure that we've done already. I'm sorry. Oh, we didn't finish the Shulchan Aruch. Okay. Shin Lamed Aleph, yes? Okay. So what we saw so far is that when they write the date, they have to write the place as well. And so let me just we'll just do the. I think we did the whole sif. I thought so, but you know what? What we said is you have to write the place where the transaction took place. Sheyichtavu kaninu miploni b'makom ploni, the kasavnu v'chasamnu masarnu liploni. That we were participants in a transaction that was done with so and so at such and such a place, and we hereby have written the shtar, and we have signed it, umasarnu liploni, and have given it to so and so. Ucheshekosvim makom haksiva kosvim kaninu miploni, v'kasavnu v'chasamnu biyom ploni b'makom ploni. And when they write it, when they're writing the place of the writing of the shtar, that's when they're writing the place of the transaction. And then that they should also write, it was enacted here in this city, or not enacted, but it was written here in this city. And we made the kinyan from Ploni, and then we wrote and we signed on such and such a date in such and such a place. So it's really preferable to write both the date and the place of the transaction, and the date and the place of the writing of the shtar. When do we say this? That's, you only have to write the place of the writing of the shtar if the law of the place of the transaction and the place of the writing is exactly the same. Or even if the law is somewhat different, then as long as you say that the transaction was made according to the laws of such and such. So, for example, the transaction was made in New York, and we sign the shtar, or we write up the shtar in Toronto. So as long as you say, you can write that the transaction was made according to the laws of the city and state of New York, and the shtar was written and signed here in the city of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Aval ima matbea mishtana mimokom haksiv l'mokom hakinyan ve'in kosev bishtar matbea hayotzi b'mokom ploni lo yichtavu ela makom hakinyan. He says, however, if the law is changed from the place of the writing to the place where the transaction took place, and it doesn't say in the shtar, we did the transaction according to the laws of New York City, then you should only write the place where the kinyan took place. You should only say that we did the transaction in New York City, even though you may not remember the date when the transaction took place. So sometimes you have to mix and match when you only have some facts and you don't have other facts. Bekosvin zman haksiva, and you write down the date of the writing. Sometimes you may remember where the transaction took place, but not the date. And in that situation, you would write, we did the transaction in New York City several weeks ago. You don't know anything more specific. And here it is, signed on such and such a date. And you don't write the place where the signing took place. Because you only the only noteworthy issue is where the transaction took place, because that was the two parties indebted themselves to the laws of that place. If you would write the place of the writing of the shtar instead, then the laws of the place where the shtar is written, let's say Toronto in this case, would be the prevailing law, and that could actually pervert justice. Okay, so that's what we've seen so far. So let's take a look. We have Ayin Zayin, Ayin Ches, and Ayin Tes in the Imrei Yaakov. So let's take a look now. Hamakom Shenasa Bo Hakinyan. So Das HaShulchan Aruch De'ein Lichtov Elamakom Hakinyan Bilvad. Aval Asma Kosav the Harbe Gonim Svirlu the Bazer Kosvin Shnei Hamakomos. Right, I thought we saw this. Oh, all right. I thought you told me we didn't. Okay. So why don't we start Tes Zayin again? Okay. Utzrichim ha'edim ledaktek b'lashon hakinyan shekonin miyad hamischayev. That the edim have to be very precise in the language of the transaction, and they have to specify shekonin miyad hamischayev, that a kinyan was made with the debtor. Okay, let's say it's a loan, and the Edom are writing up a contract for the creditor. They have to write up that they accepted, that they took or they made a kinyan, they gave a handkerchief to the debtor. Litain eze davar miyad olizman ploni, and that obligates him to give something to the creditor, either immediately if it's a purchase, let's say, or at a certain date later on, let's say if it's a loan. Bein ma'os, bein karka, bein metaltalin, bein mezanos, umalbushin. And they have to specify whether it's cash, real estate, chattel, food, clothing, etc. Shezeh hakinyan eino klum, ve'ein kosvin oso ela imkain omer lahem b'lashon chiyuv al nafsho. Right, this is what we were talking about. He says, if a person, if they just simply write in the shtar that the debtor obligates himself to give, that's not sufficient, or the debtor is going to give. He says that language is insufficient. He says what they have to write it is, Ein kosvenoso elim kain omer lehem b'lashon chiyuv al nafsho shemechayev es atzmo litain miyad olizman ploni. They have to hear from the debtor that he hereby obligates himself. I hereby place an obligation upon myself to give either immediately or at some time later to the creditor what I owe him. Aval imlo omer b'lashon chiyuv al nafsho. But if he didn't use the language of I hereby obligate myself, but rather Ela Omar etain, rather he just said I will give biyad olizman ploni, whether it's immediately, let's say they're doing a purchase or a loan. Afal pi shekanu miyado al zeh ein zeh klum. He says even though there was a kinyan, that kinyan is null and void. Ki kinyan al amiras etain u kinyan al dvarim levad. He says when you make a kinyan on a person saying I will give, that's not sufficient. That's an insufficient kinyan. It's a kinyan on words. But the reality is that when you make a kinyan, it is actually falling upon not the person's words, but rather an object. Hanikne, that is being transacted. So, for example, when I say, I hereby make a kinyan, let's say I'm selling you something. So you give me a handkerchief. That means that in exchange for that handkerchief, I am the object that I am selling you, the car or the book or whatever it is, now is exchanged to you in some way. But it has to be phrased in such a way where it's clear that that's what the kinyan is going on. It's going on the transacted object or the transacted individual. But if it just says, a person says, I will give you something, that's not, there's no transaction on an object or on a person. So you have to be precise with the language. If the object is the transacted item, so for example, I'm selling you my car, you give me a handkerchief, and in exchange for the handkerchief, I'm selling you my car. So I hereby make a kinyan such that the car now becomes yours. That's if it's an immediate transaction. Vim eno makneo lo me'achshav ela omer sheyitnenu lo miyad o lizman ploni, ena kinyan chal al ze ela al gufo v'nafsho shel hanosin sheyitnenu lo. So he says, but if it's not an immediate transaction, but he says that he will give it to him in the future. Ena kinyan chal al ze. So he says the kinyan will not work. The kinyan is not going on the transacted item when he just says, I will give you. Ella al gufo v'nafsho shel hanosin sheyitnenu lo im omer b'lo shem chiyav shem yischayish etzas molite. But if he says, I hereby obligate myself, so then the transaction is going on me, it's not going on the object. But you have to make sure that the transaction goes on something. It has to either go on the object or it has to go on the person who's obligating himself. But if it doesn't go on either of those parties, but a person just says, I will give you something, then that's not a legitimate transaction, because the transaction is not falling upon. I'm not sure, there must be a more legal term that I could use. There's no applicant. I don't know if that's the word. It's not being applied to an object. The transaction has to be applied to an object. The object has to be either the item that's being sold or the person who is indebting himself. So it has to go on either a person or a thing. But if it's not, the transaction is not falling upon or being applied to a person or a thing, then it's not a legitimate kinyan. Well, here we're not talking about the mechanism. Here the mechanism is a kinyan. It could either be with a handshake, or it could be with a handkerchief, or it could be with an exchange of cash. But here we're talking about the language that is applied at the time of the kinyan. Okay, so v'lachei nagu lichtov tenoim achronim b'shas hanesuin v'lodai barishonim. And then he switches gears. He says it is for this reason that there is a custom to write a second set of tenoim at a wedding. They used to do a tenoim at the engagement, and they did a second tenoim right before the chuppah. Below dai barishonim, and the first set of tenoim is insufficient. Now, why is that? He says because when they write the first tenoim at the engagement, we don't do this anymore, but I guess some communities still do it. When they would commit themselves at the time of the engagement, they didn't say we hereby obligate ourselves. They just said we will give. The father promises to give such and such. The father-in-law, the father of the bride, promises to give such and such. The father of the groom promises to give such and such. And the reason why they write it in the first set of tenoim in that way, and again, this is like a window into time back in history when they would write it in this way, is that we're worried that one of the two sides will break the engagement. And I don't want there to be a binding obligation on either party other than the payment of a penalty. So let's say in the old days, there was a commitment that each party would put in an exorbitant amount of money for the shtetl in Poland or Russia, right? He'll give 10,000 rubles, he'll give 10,000 rubles. And that's what they wrote in the Tanakh. But because they wrote it as he'll give and he'll give, this gives them wiggle room such that if the engagement is broken, there will not be an obligation for each party to put up the money, but rather there'll be a penalty. Let's say 1,000 rubles from each party. We'll see what the convention was. Ki hacherem hakosov b'tanoim eno klum ad shekablehu b'ferush. That he says because when they write the words cherem in the original Tanoim document at the engagement, that each side accepts upon himself a cherem, a ban of excommunication if they back out of the deal, that was not really binding. Okay? And it was only to enforce the requirement that each party would pay a knas, would pay a penalty if the engagement is broken and was not meant to be taken as a real cherem, as a real acceptance of excommunication. So, that it won't, right. So they wrote it in a way that each side will have to pay a penalty, but it was also written in a way that it will allow them an escape from having to pay the full amount that's written in the Tanoim. So we'll only be obligated to pay, let's say, 1,000 ruble penalty, but not the full 10,000 rubles. Okay, so we have to go back and we really have to carefully break this halacha down in order to really understand it. Yeah. Right, that's right. There's a commitment to the penalty and there's an escape clause to allow them to not go through with the deal in the event that the engagement is broken, right? Correct. And that's the reason why you need a second Tanoim, he says, because the first Tanoim is not enough to enforce the commitment of the original 10,000 rubles on each side.
Even though they had the stipulation that we're in for $1 billion, if someone comes out, goes much point to that, obviously, and then you ended up.
Yeah, thank God he did. Okay.
And also, he said, in baseball, one of the only things today is, players of the team, if they don't re-sign him, there's a clause there that they have to pay them out. A certain amount. So you either have to keep them or pay them out.
Okay, right. Okay, so let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov here. The ein kosvin oso. So when they write the shtar, they have to use a specific language that where the kinyan is going on a certain object or person. So if the language at the time of the transaction was not properly formed, meaning that there was no verbal commitment of an object or a person, so then even the writing of the shtar will not be valid and they will not be enforceable because the witnesses will be called to testify in Beis Din. And they say, did you hear this guy say that he committed himself or the merchandise to the other party? And if they say no, we just heard him say he'll give him the item, so then that's not binding. Amar etein miyad, pirish. So let's explain this. After Amar bilashon miyad, even if a guy said, I will give this to you immediately, Mikol makom hol v'lo amar me'achshav lo kana. He has to use the word me'achshav, from now. The lashon etein mashma'o she'eno nosein lo achshav berega zeh shel hakinyan rak achar kach. He says, because when you say I will give, etein, in the future tense, it implies that this is something that you will do in the future, but not immediately. V'lachein avsha ha'acher kach hainu miyad lo moil keben debishas ma'aser shel hakinyan lo hikneu. Because and apparently saying I will give is sort of a malformed language, because the transaction has to go on something right now at the time of the kinyan, right? So if you say I will give you something, and we shake or we make a kinyan with a handkerchief, or however we do the mechanics of the kinyan, it's a contradiction, because saying I will do something implies it will be done in the future, and there's nothing that's happening right now at the time of the transaction. That's the way Rav Stern explains why there's a deficiency over here. You're mixing and matching tenses, and therefore you have to say etein me'achshav. If you say I will give you from this moment, me'achshav, from this moment, you're actually rectifying the future tense of the language etein. Okay, hu kinyan al dvarim levad. And if a kinyan is only made on words and it's not made on an object, either the merchandise or the person, it's not valid. We find this discussion in the Gemara in the very beginning of Maseches Bava Basra. For those of you who have learned Bava Basra, the first chapter is all about the division of real estate that is owned by partners. So let's say two partners have a piece of property, and they've owned it, let's say, for years as a joint ownership in a corporate ownership of this property, and they decide that they would like now to divide it. Now, there are certain properties that lend themselves to division more easily than others. This is one of those pieces of property that doesn't lend itself easily to division. The Afal Gav, so they need to actually make a very binding agreement in order for that property to be considered divided. Okay? The Afal Gav dekanu miyadam kol echad mehem yachol lachzor bo mipnei shezeh kinyan dvarim. He says, in that situation, the Gemara says that if each party just simply agreed in principle that they were going to divide it in the future, even though they made a kinyan on that agreement, that's not legally binding. Uperish hadavar, the whole kinyan, hainu sha'akona nosein sudru l'makna u'makneu lo, v'hamakna makna l'keneged asudar achefet sha'akona rotza liknoso. He says, because the mechanism of a kinyan is I give you a handkerchief, and in exchange, you give me, at the time you exchange with me for that handkerchief, the object which I wish to acquire from you. So when you have two partners who wish to divide their property that they own jointly, each party will take a handkerchief from the other, and in exchange for that, will give up their portion of ownership in the half of the property that the other party is acquiring exclusively. Okay? You understand? That's the mechanism. So he says, "Ve'hamakna makna lo keneged asudar achefet shakona rotza liknoso. Ve'lochein b'chaluka sachatzer kishakona miyado ala chaluka ein kan shum davar sheyachol levakinyan bazeh shemakna lo esudro mishum dahachaluka ein ba mamish ve'ein hakinyan chal al yada." He says, when a piece of property is not meant to be divided, it doesn't lend itself to easy division, then you have to do much more than just doing a handkerchief exchange, because there the two parties are not able to relinquish ownership in a property that's not normally meant to be divided. That's essentially what he's explaining. And he says, "V'hachanami ken keshomer etein." And the same thing is true over here when a person merely says, "I will give you my car." Let's say I'm selling you my car. I will give you my car because you give me a handkerchief, and in exchange for that handkerchief, I will give you my car. He says, "Gamim kanu mimenu al ze lo havi kinyan she'ein ze ela havtacha," because the statement "I will give you my car" is a promise of what I will do in the future. It's not, the kinyan is not going on the car itself. Okay, gamim kan aval lo nasa b'zeh ma'aseh kinyan, right? But the kinyan has not fallen upon the object. Elatzarach lomar olichtov b'shtar nasati sadaplonis leploni, o nesuna hi leploni. So therefore, the tense has to be changed. It has to say the car or the field is given or has been given to so and so. Oh, harehu shalo, or it is his. It is now his from this moment. So that as soon as the contract or the handkerchief is exchanged, the party immediately acquires the object of purchase. But if it's just with a verbal expression of I will give you my car, I will give you my field, then even the handkerchief exchange is insufficient. Ulam im amar b'lashon hoda'a yesh omrim dekana. So again, the way that it's working is that if a person says the field is now yours, and we make a kin, or we shake hands, or whatever the mechanism is, or there's an exchange of a shtar, so that the witnesses now have a legitimate language that they can apply. So again, this is all just basically stating you have to be very careful with the language that you use at the time of the transaction, both the language that's recorded in the shtar and the language that you use verbally as well. According to some opinions, if there's just an acknowledgement, the property is yours, but which is what the seller says to the buyer, then that's not enough of a language to basically say that it's a binding transaction.
From the 30 of these years.
Right. So you have to say, I hereby obligate myself, or you have to say, from this moment on, the property is yours. Right. So by doing that, I think what you're asking, Mordechai, is what if you do a kinyan where possession of the property doesn't take place until later? So can you do that? Right. So the Gemara does allow such a kinyan. The Gemara allows a person to make a kinyan saying that it is yours after 30 days. 30 days from now, the land is yours based on the kinyan that we make at this moment. That's provided that the land is present both today, it's in my possession both today and in 30 days from now, right? So that's not what we're addressing now, but you're saying hypothetically, could it be done? Yes, it can be done according to halacha. Okay, we'll hold it here. Yeah. We don't do that today, but they used to do it back in the day. And they would obligate it that as soon as they're, or like in preparation for their matrimonial home, we will commit to each party, we'll furnish the home or whatever. So they would actually bring the furniture in the home actually before the wedding day. Right, correct. All right, have a great day, everybody. We'll do one more shiur tomorrow, and then we'll take a break.